and welcome again to Expounding the Bible. I'm your host, Nathaniel Morel. In this study, we are going to talk about Bible prophecy, the book of Genesis, the 7 years of famine during Egypt, and socialism. And I got with me here Pastor Derek Seagle. If you remember him, we've done a couple videos in the past before. Yep. And we are going to study the Bible here and see what does the book of Genesis, how does that, which it's a book that it's the first book of the Bible, and we always look at it as just a historical book, right. But there is actually a lot of parallel when it comes to Bible prophecy, when it comes to today's world, and Pastor Derek is going to show that here for us. But I want to open our Bibles. Let's open our Bibles to the book of 1 Corinthians. The book of 1 Corinthians, as we'll begin to lay the foundation work on this. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And let's focus on verse 11. And here Paul is talking to the church of Corinth. And the church of Corinth is a predominantly Gentiles church that has nothing to do with Jews or anything. And Paul here is giving a history to the Gentiles at Corinth. He's giving them history of his own Jewish people from the scriptures. And here he tells them, he says, now all these things, all the things that has happened in the Word of God, in the Old Testament and so forth, now all these things, Paul says, happened to them, the ancient Israelites, for samples or examples today, and are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the earth are come. So Paul here is addressing the church at Corinth, giving them history, Jewish history, to his present, to the Gentiles, and to the world, to whom the ends of the world are come, which is his future, which will be our present and also our future. That's right. So whatever we study here in the Bible is written for an example by God, so we can take heed and know what are the signs of the times. That's true. As Matthew 24, the signs of Jesus coming, that we can take heed lest we be caught unawares. Correct. So if Derek, you can take us straight away and he'll open us up in the book of Genesis.
Again, Genesis, the 41st chapter, there's much that we can pull out of this. What I began to understand years ago, I began to study the book of Genesis, but I began to study it in a deeper, in a more detailed form. And one of the things that began to open up to my mind as I began to study this in a deeper form, breaking it down chapter by chapter, was I began to see and understand. And I never thought about the book. I never heard of the book of Genesis mentioned in this fashion. But I found that it is true that the book of Genesis is highly prophetic. I never thought of the book of Genesis as being a book of prophecy. But it is.
Neither did I. I will just read it as a history lesson of the Jews.
That's what I did too. But the book of Genesis has tremendous application for God's church today and what has happened. We're going to be taking a look at the time of Joseph in Egypt and the issues that were involved. And we'll open up in the 41st chapter of Genesis. And here in Genesis 41, we're going to read verses 41, verse 1, and then 8 and 12. And we're going to pick up and we're going to get the context. And what we're doing is, first, we're going to see how this whole thing got set up. How did it get set up? We'll examine that. We'll break that down. We'll go through all the issues involved there. And then what we'll see after we see how it was set up, then we're going to see the results of how all these things happened. So, Exodus 41st chapter, verse 1, and it says this, and it says, and it came to pass that at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by a river. Now, most of us, we're not going to go through the details of the dream. Most of you are probably familiar with that's with the 7 fat kind, the 7 skinny kind. The skinny ate up the fat. Then you had the corn. Right, and you had the same situation with the corn.
And he couldn't find an interpretation for the dream. And
right. This is very interesting. Verses 8 and 12. It says, and it came to pass in the morning that that is Pharaoh's spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for, watch this, the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof, and Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret it unto Pharaoh. What happens here is there was a person who was in prison with Joseph, who Joseph interpreted a dream for him, and he's back in, I think he's a butler.
He's the butler.
He's the butler. Verse 9, it says, Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, and saying, I do remember my faults this day. Then he describes to Pharaoh, there's this Jewish guy in the prison, and he interpreted my dreams. You know, what I found out was very important, that Egyptians were very big on dreams. They had people back in those days that were paid for nothing but for someone to come in and they tell them their dream and they tell them the interpretation thereof. They were very huge on thinking that all of their dreams had some specific meaning. So if you got a group of people like that, all you need is a group of people that can sit over here and say, we can cash in on this. You know, so that was their job, and Egyptians were big on their dreams. So here we have Pharaoh having a dream, and Pharaoh was troubled, and he could not
find an interpretation
on the dream. Let's go down again to verse 12. This man says to Pharaoh, the butler, he says, There was with us a young man, a Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream did he interpret it. So,
Joseph.
That was Joseph. They bring Joseph up. Verse 14, it says, Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him. So they bring Joseph up out of the prison, of course, and they clean him up and they bring him in before Pharaoh. And now you begin to have the setting, how God is beginning to establish. The Lord is in control of this entire event, and he brings us to Pharaoh, and now we have Joseph coming onto the scene. So we have the setting here. We know what the dream is. And so let's move quickly to the same chapter, verses 32 through 35.
All right.
And now we're going to have Joseph beginning to interpret the dream. And it says this, Genesis chapter 41, starting with verse 32. And it says this, And for the dream that was, Joseph said, the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So Joseph suggests to Pharaoh, he says, Now let Pharaoh look at a man discreet and wise, and let him, and set him over the land of Egypt, and let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the fifth. Now it's very interesting. I'm going to begin to mention something here. I'm not going to give you the point yet, but I'm going to start to mention something to you about how we are, what we are looking at, because we're dealing with issues that are social, political, and economic.
Before you get into that, just to highlight the gap that we went over.
Right.
So Pharaoh had the dream. He had
Yes.
the dream of the 7 cattle, fat cattle, and the skinny cows,
Yes.
and the corn and the withered corn,
Correct.
which Joseph interpreted as meaning that there was going to be a famine
Yes.
that was going to happen in Egypt. 7 good years
Of plenteous.
come, and then followed by 7 years of famine. And he basically confirmed the dream to Pharaoh, because Pharaoh had 2 dreams representing the same
Correct.
thing. So as Joseph here gives the interpretation, now he's giving to Pharaoh the solution to the problem,
Right.
which is what Pastor Derek is going to get us into.
True. Yeah, I did skip over that. So that's basically a summary of Joseph interpreting, and he said, God has done this. It is going to come to pass. He said he gave it to you twice. He said it's shortly going to come to pass. Verse 34, Joseph is suggesting to Pharaoh, as he's talking to Pharaoh, he says, let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land and take up the... Now again, watch the terminology. This is very interesting, the language that we see here. He says, let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land. And then he says, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years, and let them... Now watch this again here. You're going to have it again. I'm not going to tell you exactly what it is right now, but I'll show you what it is as we move on through the study. And then he says in verse 35, and let them gather all the food of those good years that come and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the city. So here again, like I said, we have the setting, and farther down in here, Pharaoh says to Joseph, we can go to verse 39, for as much as God hath showed you all these things, there was none so discreet and wise as thou. And then he says to Joseph, thou shalt be over my house, and according to unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than you.
So he went all the way up from prisoner and a slave
to prime minister of Egypt.
Minister and second in command, basically almost vice president.
Vice president
was over the whole
of Egypt. So in one day, God takes Joseph from the prison to vice president or prime minister of Egypt. So this is the setting, and this is how it is. And there were, of course, as we know, history even bears witness to this. I've seen some documentaries on this. It's very interesting that even in Egypt, they can prove that this happened. And this was from secular sources, not from religious sources. They know that this happened. So we see how it was set up, verses 46 through 49. I want to read here. It says this, same chapter, it says, and Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went out through all the land of Egypt. And then it says, and in the 7 plenteous years, the earth brought forth by handfuls. And watch this. And he, that is Joseph, gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. The food of the field which was round about every city laid he up in the same. Verse 49, it said, Joseph, watch this, gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. So we can see here.
That's just a fifth of the harvest.
That's correct.
That's just 1/5.
1/5.
That he collected every year from everybody.
Correct. So everybody that owned fields, and back in those days, they owned their own fields. Mm-hmm. In Egypt, it was kind of like some of the things you see here in America today. Family owned, family operated. This is very important. And then the government required that, because it was bountiful harvest for 7 years. Absolutely over the top when their crops came in, and God had blessed mightily. And 1/5 of everything that everybody grew in the land of Egypt, the state took and stored it in the city. So you have the setup here, 46 through 49, and we can see how this is all going to work out. Now watch, let's begin to pick up on, we've seen the 7 plenteous years, and how the state took 1/5 of the harvest and stashed it around through Egypt, so it would be evenly distributed and more easily to get to for the people. But now we're going to start watching a change, and I'm going to see if you pick up on the change of events, because we're going from the bountiful years, now we're getting into the drought situation. Okay? This is the drought. We're going to pick it up in verse 55 through 57 of the same chapter. And let's see if we begin to see a difference on how things were done. Very interesting. And we'll see this. And it says here in verse 55, it says, when all the land of Egypt was famished, it says, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, go unto Joseph, what he saith to you, he says, do. Verse 56, it says, and the famine was over all the face of the earth. Now watch this. Here we're going to see something unusual happening. And Joseph opened all the storehouses, and what's that next word? It says, and
sold.
Did what?
He sold.
Ah.
He sold to the Egyptians.
He sold. unto the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in all the land of Egypt.
So he collected a fifth of the harvest
Right.
for free, for nothing,
Right.
and then he sold it back to them. That's a 100% profit.
Everybody would love to do business like this. You get your product for free, you have absolutely nothing invested, and then you sell it back. 100% profit. Nothing invested. Verse 57 it says, now watch this. This is very interesting because this has direct application. As Nathan had read what Paul said to the church at Corinth, has direct application. He said, Paul said he was teaching the Gentiles Jewish history in their time. He was emphasizing the significance to the Gentiles, the history of the Jews, for them. But the history of the Jews has, Paul also said, and it is for those upon whom the ends of the world are come. This is the time that you and I are living today. This is the time that Paul said, upon whom the ends of the world are come. This is where we are. It says in verse 57, watch this, because this isn't limited just to Egypt. Watch this. It says, and all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to do what?
Buy corn.
Buy corn. Because the famine was so sore in how many lands?
All lands.
All the lands. So this was not just a localized drought they were having at the time. This was a global drought. And one of the things we can say here at this point is, what did the people begin to experience? Today, we call it food shortages.
And we begin to see that in the past couple years.
Yes.
With not just here in America, but in other parts of the country.
Of the world.
Of the world, I mean, I'm sorry.
Of the world. We are seeing this becoming, this is telling us, in their sense, in their day, this was a global problem.
It was a crisis.
That's correct.
And usually when you have a shortage of famine, it's usually also water supply goes down.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Water supply is down because how are you going to feed your crops?
Correct.
So we can assume, it's safe to assume the Nile was short and it
Yes,
wasn't
it was.
raining.
Right.
And then we can parallel this with, I was just thinking with Elijah, with the 3 years of famine.
Yes. That's excellent.
The water springs and the brook dried up.
Right.
And when you bring that in our day, because this is Bible prophecy application to
Right.
us today, you look at the westward states like California, for instance.
For sure.
Their reservoirs, their water's drying
We're
up.
drying up terribly.
I was reading just yesterday in Italy.
Really?
I believe it's the Po River.
Really?
Which is up in northern Italy where the Alps are.
Yes.
That's a main river. They're used to having, I believe they said, 180,000 gallons per minute flowing through that river.
Wow.
They're barely getting, from 180,000 gallons per minute, they're barely getting, I believe the number was 30,000 gallons per minute. That river,
wow, what a cut.
That river came down so much that even there was a World War II ship that sunk in that river, and it became almost fully exposed.
Wow.
So that, and they were saying that will affect not just their drinking supply,
Yes.
but also the food supply
for
in
sure.
northern Italy. And we see, what's going on with Russia and Ukraine and even in Africa,
Yes.
a whole bunch of drought, rain,
yes.
food famine, pestilence, affecting the food crisis in the world and prices on everything.
Right. So the point is that Nathan is making, and it is true, you see a food shortage. So far, all you see is a food shortage. But it's very important to see also, too, that the government owns the food. They got it in for free, and now they're selling back to the people. So how do you think Pharaoh feels about this?
It's kind of like government controlling the food system, which will be a form of socialism or communism.
Yes,
as it were.
A control, a form of control. We will see this developing as we continue on, but I wanted to bring out the point it says, go out, and Pharaoh says, I'm going to take 1/5 of your crop. So for those 7 years that happened, and it's plenteous, but then when the plague hits, now they're selling it, and all the money is going back to the state.
So they're profiting big time.
Pharaoh's got to be loving this. Let's now move to the same book. This is Genesis. Let's move over a couple of chapters.
All right.
And let's go to the Genesis, the 47th chapter.
So now this is where the famine is progressing and becoming
Yes.
worse and worse.
Yeah, right. That is true. We're deep into the famine now. And what God is going to show us through this, because of what we are seeing today, not just in America, but this is on a global scale, as we know. God is going to show us, and He's going to break it down step by step, how this is happening today. What we see here in Genesis, and Paul says, this is written for our admonition upon whom the ends of the world are come. We are going to see step by step these very same things happening, and it not just in the future, but they are happening right now. You're going to be able to apply what we're seeing here, what I've already showed you some, and that is food shortages.
Remember how Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24, when the disciples told him, what are the signs of your coming?
Oh, yes.
And Jesus said, and Matthew 24 is a straight up prophetic.
Prophecy.
It's not like Daniel Revelation that is symbolism.
Right.
Matthew 24, Jesus tells you straight up there's going to be not just wars and rumors of wars and commotions and
Yes.
nations against
That's
nations,
correct.
but he says there's also going to be famine and pestilences
That's correct.
and earthquakes in
That's
diverse
true.
places. So what we're reading here in Egypt, which was a global crisis,
Okay.
Christ says is going to happen again. It's going to be one of the signs of the times in the future. And I believe we may be getting a little taste of that right now.
Yes.
As we're seeing war around the world.
Right.
And we're seeing food shortages and prices are going up.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is.
As you're going to, we're already deep here in the famine in
Correct.
chapter 47.
And I can say this, what we see happening in America and around the world right now, it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. So we're in Genesis, the 47th chapter. Now we're going to see, as Nathan had brought out, we're deeper into the famine. Okay? Now we're going to really begin to see how this is going to break down and how this has 100% application to the times in which we are living. And God breaks it down step by step. And I can see this already in America. I can already see what's happening here. So let's pick it up, chapter 47. Let's pick it up in verse 14. It says, and Joseph gathered up all the money. Watch how this goes. Watch how this goes. He gathers up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan. So here we are. It's not just Egypt, but I'm sure it's in Arabia. I'm sure it's in Africa, and it's up in Canaan.
Probably some of Europe with Greece.
Probably, yeah, I would say so, for sure. So he gathers up the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the corn which they brought. Now watch this. And Joseph brought the money into where?
Pharaoh's house.
Oh boy.
So now you brought it to the treasury.
Right. He brought it to the state. So it's very interesting, again, the state not only controls the food, but the state is getting all of the money in, and it's going to the state.
So now the government has most of the money in the country.
Of the wealth. The government is taking control of the wealth.
That we saw that recently.
Yes.
About 20, 30 years ago when we see Venezuela.
Oh, yeah.
And Venezuela was one of the top, I believe it was one of the top 5 or one of the top 10 countries in the world as being prosperous and economically.
That's true, they were.
Economically prosperous. and we have Hugo Chavez,
Yes.
who ended up becoming, he was elected president, he ended up becoming dictator in power, and he switches the country from a capitalist state, which is I grow, you grow, we trade, we buy and we sell, and we both become
We set our
wealthy,
limits. We set our limits.
and set it up to a socialist form of government, which now the government starts buying up privately owned
and taking control of everything.
And now everybody's buying food from the government.
Yes.
And the government owns everything.
And what do they have?
And now look at Venezuela now.
Food shortage.
Food shortage, broke, economic collapse, probably the worst we've ever seen in the past century. And other countries have followed the same way whenever this form of system of government has been put in place. So can the same thing happen? Will we see the same thing happening to Egypt?
Let's take a look.
All right.
Okay. So we see the money, the wealth pouring into the capital.
It works good for now, but what are the results?
Now watch the next verse. Watch the next verse. Verse 15. Watch what happens. It says, and when money failed in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan. Stop. What did the money do?
Money failed.
They collapsed
The
economy, and they took control of the currency, and they collapsed the currency.
So now you can't, since the government has all the money, people are broke and have nothing to buy because there's famine here.
Right.
And the government's not going to give out money to people.
No.
They want it for themselves.
Oh, yes.
So now you have a collapsed economy is broke.
Correct.
We can see that similarly in after World War I. What happened to the German economy?
Completely collapsed. The Deutschmark collapsed as a result of World War I, which began to bring in and set up the Nazi Party, which was the National Socialist Party. So we will see, did this very same thing happen in Egypt? Watch this. Watch what happens. I thought this was marvelous based on my understanding of history and the past, how socialism has come to the rise, has taken over in countries, what has happened to the people. And then I began to read this. I was going, oh my, watch this. Again, verse 15, it says, and when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians, watch this, came to Joseph and said, give us bread, for why should we die in the presence? For the money does what?
Faileth.
The money has failed. They have no currency. So let me ask you this, those of you who are watching, those of you who are in touch with what's happening. What's happening to our currency right now?
Inflation. Our money is no longer can get us what we are used to buying.
Our money is failing.
I mean, you can look at the price of gas. 2-3 years ago, with $10, I can buy almost 6 gallons of gas.
Yes.
Now with $10, I could barely get 2.
Yeah.
So I could no longer, my money is failing.
Right.
When it comes to what I can get with it.
Our money is failing. And why? Because of the government. The government is collapsing our currency. And that's a very long study and a very long, very good study. But that's for another time, how our government, because when Egypt was at the peak of prosperity and power in the world, what was their currency? Gold and silver.
Same thing with ancient Rome.
Rome, when they were at the peak of power and prosperity, what was their currency?
Gold and silver.
Gold and silver. We can say that of Israel too, actually.
And also of America, we were under the gold standard.
Right. That's where I was going. When America was at the peak of her power and prosperity, our currency was gold and silver. And we had the gold standard at that time, meaning that every $20 bill was backed by $20 worth of gold because gold was pegged at $20. So a $20 gold piece would buy you the same as a $20 bill. Today, a $20 gold piece, which is 1 ounce of gold, is worth about $1,900 About 1900. I saw it the other day.
That's how much inflation has changed over.
Right. And our dollar is worth hardly. So the point is,
We can see also similar thing in Revelation 18
yes, we can.
with Babylon.
In the pure
Which,
sense of the word.
as we've studied before here, Babylon is a representation of the Roman Catholic power,
Yes.
which will, with the Antichrist and through the mark of the beast,
Right.
take control over the whole world through this globalist one world
Economic.
government.
It's an
New world
economic
order.
issue. Yes, it is.
And when you read in Revelation 18, you see that Babylon owns everything.
Yes, they do.
The merchants,
Merchants of
the
the
merchants
world.
of the world, the corporations, the grand corporations.
Yes, they do.
The kings of the earth are committing fornication with her, so they're
Yes.
in cahoots with this whole
Right.
thing.
There's your church
So
estate.
Babylon owns everything in the whole world, and because of that, what do we see in Revelation 18? They collapsed.
They eventually collapse too, and that's the final collapse, and that's coming.
Because when you keep sucking and sucking and sucking money from people,
That's right.
eventually,
Yeah.
as an elite government, you're going to be rich, but it's going to
Yes.
collapse because you need everyone to participate in a free market.
Yeah.
But if you're just going to suck the money off of it, which is what Pharaoh was basically
This
doing
is what
here.
was happening. This is what was happening.
Now your money faileth, your economy faileth. Do we have
Yes.
anything more?
Okay, let's go to verse 16. It says, "And Joseph, the people come to him, give us bread, for why should we die in thy presence? For our money faileth."
Faileth. So the currency is gone.
The currency is gone. So Joseph says, "Give your cattle, and I will give for you cattle. I will give you for your cattle." And they're talking about give us bread for our cattle.
So now they're trading with livestock.
Right. And then he says, if money fails. So the government knew that they were completely taking control of the currency. And they were controlling the people through the food. It's going to be an issue of food. So the people, he says, again, so the government takes control of the livestock. First they control the grain. Now we're going to take all of the livestock. Verse 17, it says this. They brought their cattle unto Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for horses, flocks, and for the cattle, for the herds, for the asses, and he fed them with bread for all their cattle for that year.
That year.
Right. So now the government is taking, and I'm going to ask some of you people, do you know what these multilateral corporations are doing in America and in Africa and other places around the world? They are buying up all of the land.
Well, it just came out some months ago. You look at Bill Gates.
Yeah, that's
And
what
Bill
I was talking
Gates,
about.
I mean, this is like
Number one.
multi-billionaire.
Yes.
I mean, a computer tech who's now into the health world of government.
Yes.
With this pandemic and all.
With the WHO.
And he actually owns most of the farmland in America.
He does.
Now, what does he plan on
Right.
doing with all that?
Oh.
You're not a farmer. You're not a doctor either. You're just
No.
you're just some high elite person.
He's a globalist.
In the big pharma world,
Yes.
but you own all the farmland. And then you look at this past year, as we discussed also in this channel some months back, the Biden death tax, which was something that the Biden administration wanted to pass through legislation to increase the inheritance tax. So when,
Right.
say, if you die and you have a piece of land or a family-owned business,
Mhm.
and you wanted it to give it
Pass it.
over to me, to pass it over to your children
Right.
or whoever. Your kids, say you pass it over to myself, I would not have to pay any taxes on something inherited from me,
Correct.
from my father, my grandfather,
Right.
or anybody.
Which you shouldn't.
I shouldn't have to pay
Yeah,
taxes
you
on
shouldn't
just
have to.
inheriting it.
Correct.
Now, I would pay taxes if I sell it. If I sell
Yeah.
it, I would have to pay
Or
the taxes
you're
on it.
making money from
Right,
that.
from it. Now,
Right.
what the Biden administration wanted to pass was just for inheriting it, they'll tax me not on what it was originally bought for, but on what it's worth currently. So, say I'm a farmer and I have 200-300 acres of farmland,
Yes.
which is probably worth close to $1 million doesn't mean that I'm a multimillionaire. I don't have $1 million in the bank.
Yeah.
I just have a piece of land that's worth that much, and I want to pass it over to my child so he could continue to farm and provide for the families in this nation. But then he gets the inheritance, and just for inheriting it, he has to pay taxes on that $1 million piece of land. He don't have the money to pay that.
Right.
So what is he going to have to do? He's going to have to sell it to who? The government.
The state.
The government's going to buy up everything. The mom and papa's restaurants and businesses are going to go under because when they pass it to their kids, these mom and papa restaurants aren't going to have enough money to pay for it. So now you're going to have the government buying everything and controlling the
You see the government
flow.
controlling everything.
And we discussed more about this Biden death tax in the video, the Biden death tax in Revelation 17. If you want to go at the end of this video, you can go to the end screen, and I'll also have it in the description below, and you can see it after this study. But that's just parallel as what was happening in Egypt to what's happening now.
To what's happening
Government
now.
is currently in the process of buying up all the food lands and
you
all
see that the government is taking control of everything.
Money, livestock, land.
So far, they've taken the money. They got the money. Next, they're taking their livestock. All of that, the government is owning all of that. Let's read on to verse 18. And that was for that year, when the plague was really bad. The drought was really bad. Verse 18, it says this. When that year was ended, they came unto him the second year, and said unto him, We will not hide it from my Lord, how that our money
Is
spent. We have no money. Also, it says, My Lord also hath or owns our herds of cattle. There is not, watch this, what happens here next. This is most shocking, but this is where we're heading. It says this, There is not aught left in thy sight of my Lord, but our bodies and our lands.
So now they're selling themselves over.
Now the state controls everything. They control everything. So,
verse 19 is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I got 19 through 21 here. I don't have that written right, but I was wondering what. Then okay, I see what I got here.
You want to go along and
right. So the first point is let's review this again. Verse 18. It says this. At the end, when that year ended, they came unto him the second year and said unto him, We won't hide it from you, from the Lord, how that we have no money.
No money.
What's happening to you right now?
We're not having.
Are you doing any better under this administration? Your money is getting wiped out. I heard a report the other day by the large banks that owned or that control the credit cards. What would they be? Chase Manhattan,
J.P. Morgan,
probably
Bank of America.
Bank of America, and well, anyway, those large banks who own all the credit cards out there, they are saying that credit card debt is skyrocketing. That it said it's going out of sight, credit card debt. And why is that? The people don't have any money. Our government has done this to us. They are breaking us, and people now are to the point where they have to choose between buying food or putting gas in the tank. And what they're doing is they're starting to run their credit cards up. And these large, Wells Fargo was the other one I was trying to think of. They're putting out these reports, and they're watching credit card debt because why? Because as the people said here in Genesis, the money faileth. The money is failing. And in America today, the money is failing. And The government is taking over in all these areas. Let's read on again. Verse 18. When that second year was ended, it says they came unto him the second year and said unto him, We will not hide from the Lord how that our money is spent. They didn't have credit cards back in those days. They were really in trouble. My Lord also hath our herd. You own our herds of cattle. There is not left in the sight of my Lord but our bodies and our lands.
So now they're looking to give up the last of their assets.
That's all they've got left.
Their assets and their bodies.
And their bodies. Verse 19, it says, Wherefore shall we die before thine eyes, both we and our land? Buy us our land for bread. They're controlling them through food, right? Food shortages. The government is controlling this. Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be, the next word, servants.
Servants.
Now the Egyptians have gone into bondage. And who do they depend on to supply them?
Government.
The government.
So it's not in God we trust, is in...
Gov we trust. G-O-V. There's a big argument over, should we take... I got into it with some people one night, and they were saying they want to take in God we trust. And I thought, you're so phony.
So all these, what we see today, all these government programs, these social programs,
Yes.
that's supposed to be to help the people, that's run by the government.
Right.
Somebody's paying for that,
Yeah, I know
which
who's
is the
paying
middle
for it.
class.
That's us.
So the middle class money is running
Being
up,
wiped out.
and that social government programs that's supposed to be given
Yes.
to the more less fortunate, that money is going to dry up.
Correct.
And we're going to see the only ones who are going to come on top of this are the rich elites, the corporate elites of
Right.
merchants of the earth, which we see in Revelation 18,
Correct.
which they're going to fail eventually
Yes.
because it's going to catch up to them.
Oh, yeah. So what the people have become here in verse 19 is indentured servants, and now they have to work for the government. It says finishing up, our land will be servants unto Pharaoh, will be servants unto Pharaoh, and give us seed that we may live and not die, and the land be not desolate. So now the government owns all the food, all the money, all the livestock, all the land, and now, you know what else they own? All the people.
So we're looking at a earlier version of communism,
Right.
almost as it were,
Yes.
here controlling Egypt. It went through socialism,
Yes.
which is governments now getting involved in owning the means of production.
Correct.
And now
Correct.
we see that the people are now being totally enslaved into a communistic rule, and liberty now is being diminished.
Yes. And we see that even farther, what you were just saying. It says in verse 20 and 21, and we'll close up with this right now. It says, And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for who? For Pharaoh.
You're in verse what?
Verse 20.
Oh, verse 20.
For Pharaoh,
yeah,
for the government. For the Egyptians sold every man his field because of the famine prevailed over them. So the land became whose?
Pharaoh's.
Uh-oh.
So now the government owns
The government owns everything.
Don't pay your taxes and see. Don't pay your property taxes and see who's coming.
Yeah. You think you own it? Don't pay your taxes. You'll see who owns your property that you worked for and you paid for. You'll find out who really owns it. So, and here is the conclusion of the matter. It's in verse 21, and it says, now watch, now this is future. This hasn't happened to us yet, but this is coming in the future. Right now, everything we have read thus far is taking place in America today. When people want to be, and there are people that want to be totally dependent on the government, which we should never ever want to be totally dependent on the government.
The government should be finding ways for our freedom
Correct.
instead of owning our assets and our possessions.
And taking over everything. And collapsing the money, collapsing the currency.
This is all unconstitutional if the Constitution was around.
It was around back then, right. But this is what's happening in America today. So Joseph buys all the land of Egypt for the state, for the Egyptians, sold every one of his field because the famine prevailed over all the land, so the land became Pharaoh's. So the government owns all the land, which is what is happening in America today. The government is taking over everything.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you're in a sense, these people are government employees. When they actually, I did some research on this, they went back to the fields that they used to grow. They used to own, and they grew crops on them after that. But they got paid not for the crops, the government paid them. But the government had control over the crop. They owned the land, they owned the harvest, they owned everything. So the people that used to own them went back to them. The government put them back out there, but now you're government employees and now we'll send you a check. But all of the produce belongs to the government.
Sounds like the socialist, communist.
Yes, in the purest sense of the word.
Which we saw in Venezuela, and also Russia did the similar thing.
They did the same thing all around the world. We see that. Closing up verse 21, it says, "And as for the people, listen. Now this is future. This is coming. And as for the people, he removed them to the cities from one end of the borders of Egypt, even to the other end thereof."
So he took them out of their own property,
Correct.
their own land, and moved them into cities.
Yes, he did. And he put the people, all the people in the cities, he took them out of the rule, and he began to put everybody in the cities. Now, why today would they want, and in some countries it is this way. There's very little rule, such as in China and other places, but most of the people live in the cities. And this is what we're heading for today. They're wanting to get people out, and actually this has happened in the 30s and the 40s. They began to take everybody and move them into the cities.
You look at Adolf Hitler.
Yes.
And Adolf Hitler's situation is pretty interesting because he used socialism, as it were,
Yes, he did.
to set up his fascism dictatorship.
Yes, he did.
And fascism is just another, it differs a little bit from communism, but it's almost similar, but the government still owns the means of production.
Correct.
But the dictatorship is more worse. It gives Adolf Hitler the more absolute power of the Third Reich. And we see that in Adolf Hitler's fascist government, utopian world,
Yes.
he moved the Jews from their houses, put them
to the cities.
Put them in cities, or
put them in
called
cities.
ghettos, which eventually from there led to concentration camps.
Yes, he did.
So we see the similar thing going on at Nazi Germany.
Yes.
And we see even in our world today, like you mentioned China.
Yes.
China's population, America's population is 330 million, and China's is close to, I believe, 3 or 4 billion.
Wow.
And when you look at 90% or so of that population in China, it's all located in like 3 major cities.
It's in the cities. And this is what is coming for us today. As a matter of fact, they've already begun to practice this in the 30s and in the 40s, getting people off the crop and getting them into the cities.
You can control a population as a globalist.
That's what the deal is.
You can control and we saw that a couple years ago when this pandemic first started.
Yes, it did.
What was the first city to shut down here in the United States? New York.
New York.
You couldn't get in or out, and the people in there had to do whatever they were told to do.
Whatever the state said. The reason they want them in the cities today is because this is where we're going, and people are easier to control.
Now, not to not to demonize Joseph for what he was doing here.
No.
But Joseph was doing the best he could
Right.
for these people.
Right.
But looking at the parallels that he was, the concepts that he was using us today,
Yes.
we see government that uses these same parallels
Right.
usually do it with evil intentions to control people.
Yes.
And it doesn't end up good for the economy of that
Right.
country.
Like I said, I'm not passing judgment on Joseph. Joseph, man of God, this is how Joseph handled it. And how and why, that I'm not sure of. I can't answer. What I am mostly focusing on is how this whole thing got established and what were the results of what was happening here. How did it end up for the Egyptians? And we can go farther. We're not going to have time today to deal with what eventually did happen to Israel.
Well, just to summarize it, you have another Pharaoh, a new administration more or less.
Correct.
Who knew not Joseph,
Yeah.
who decided to take this even further down.
Yes, he did.
And oppress the people and put the Hebrews as slaves. So now you see what was done here, what we discussed today, was a free nation, free market.
Yes, free
going
market
under
competent.
a socialistic
Socialistic
with the
form of
only.
government. Right.
And now your servitude to that government, so now that becomes more
Yes.
communistic.
Yes.
And then later down the line, we see that form of communistic becomes a pharaoh dictator ruling by oppression, which is fascism.
Right.
So we see one after the other leading from good to bad to worse to terrible to absolute
And what
chaos.
God did for us in this example, He is showing us step by step how this happened in Egypt. And you can follow this step by step how our government is doing it in America today. You had later a change of administration. Today we've had a change of administration, and you see how badly things have gone in this country with this new change of administration, and how now the money is failing. The food, we're finding food shortages. We're having a drought. And people are more and more going into, eventually, we're going into bondage. This is what happened, how it happened in Egypt. And brethren, this is how it is happening in America today. This is what our government is doing to us today.
So that's why we must pay heed. We must continue to
Yes.
read the Word of God, because as we read in the beginning, well, Paul says what was written aforetime
Yeah, exactly. I was
applies
going there,
to
but you
us-
did it great.
applies to us today. And having
Yes.
a knowledge of Bible prophecy, and as we just read the book of Genesis, which I always saw as just a plain history book.
Yeah, I
But
did
we
too.
see that history tends to repeat itself.
Yes, it does.
And Genesis, which is a history book, actually has some prophetic significance, and we can tie it with Revelation.
Yes.
And we can go farther deep on that, but that's for another time. But what was written aforetime is for our application today, and having a good understanding of the signs of the times, because as the coming of Christ draws near, we see a whole bunch of calamities and things which will eventually bring in the 7 last plagues.
Yes, it will.
And the persecution of God's people.
And it's
All-
going to bring in the mark of the beast,
See,
also Revelation 13.
Right now, all this chaos that's happening, people are blaming it at other political parties or
Oh, of
other
course.
wars or other
Of
countries, but
course.
eventually
Right.
it's going to be blamed on God's people.
Yeah, it's going to come down to, and that's what the next administration did.
That's what the next Pharaoh
Yeah.
administration did. So having a thorough knowledge of the signs of the times, we just read what Genesis, how prophetic, highly prophetic it is for us today. It is important that we study our Bibles and see what God has in store, because God never leaves his people without a way forward.
That's correct.
He always shows us through history what
That's
the
right.
future is going to be at.
Right.
So we could prepare on what the next move is going to be, so we won't be so hard under this bondage.
Correct.
And somewhat still find a way, with all this oppression around us, find a way to spread the gospel and share it throughout the whole world.
Correct.
So others could be saved. So thank you, Derek, for
Right.
being
Glad
here.
to be here.
Maybe we can do this again sooner or later.
We will, I'm sure.
But I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, please press like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. We are also on Facebook at Expounding the Bible. Until then, this is your host, Nathaniel Morel, and Pastor Derek. We say, have a blessed day.